What do I call a table saw with no blade? Besides safe? I don't know, you could just call it a table. Stupid, because it's not sharp. Oh wait, no, I got it. What about uncut? Hey, I'm Mike Farrington. Welcome back to my shop. I'm getting ready to do a restoration of this old Delta Uni saw, and it got me thinking about table saw blades. So I thought I'd do a video on specialty table saw blades that will expand the functionality of any table saw.
All right, before moving on to the advanced course, we should do a recap of Saw Blades 101. I think the starter blade is the 40-tooth ATB or alternate top bevel blade. They're good at everything, they're not great at anything. Alternatively, you could use a 50-tooth combination blade. I'm not a big fan, but knock yourself out if you want. Next up, the mighty dado stack, which is self-explanatory. Following that should be a 24-tooth rip blade for cutting of thick solid woods. Finally, an 80-tooth high ATB blade for plywood and cross-cutting delicate materials.
All right, here's a look at the saw blades I'll be talking about. Some are rare, some are going to be more useful than others. Hopefully they're all interesting and educational. Before talking about the individual blades, why don't we start off with a pro tip, of which there's going to be a whole bunch in this video. As saw blades are used, this stuff builds up. This stuff is called pitch. So you can see this blade is a little pitchy, dog. How do you clean that off? Well, let me show you. All right, for this process, we need 2 buckets because you gotta sit on one, a dirty saw blade, some simple green, and a brass monkey, funky chunky brush to do some scrubbing.
It's a good idea to remove pitch from a saw blade occasionally. Pitch will cause a blade to run hotter due to increased friction. This increases the likelihood of burning and reduces the life of the saw blade. So if you think a blade is dull, I suggest cleaning it first. This may breathe some new life into that blade. All right, the first blade we're going to look at is a thick stock ripping blade. A normal rip blade will have 24 teeth. I think that's perfect for material up to like 1 inch thick, maybe 1.5 depending on the species. An 18-tooth rip blade is great for super thick stuff, say above 1.5 inches. When looking at a 24-tooth blade in 2-inch thick material, you can see that there's going to be like 6 teeth in contact, give or take, 3 on the upside, 3 on the downside. Compare that with the 18-tooth, and it's closer to 4, 2 on the up and 2 on the down. Fewer teeth in contact with the wood means less heat, less force required to push the wood past the blade, and less horsepower to keep the blade spinning. The plate of this blade is pretty darn thick, leading to a thicker kerf. This makes for smooth cutting blade. I'm cutting cherry here, known to burn, which is really where this blade shines. The low tooth count greatly reduces heat and the chances of burning. Look at that. Not a hint of burning and not a bad surface left behind. The next 2 are examples of situations where a ton of material needs to be removed. And again, the lower tooth count makes for quick and easy work, and that thicker blade makes for a very stable cut. Cutting a 2-inch tall tenon in some white oak is always a challenging task, and this blade handles it with ease. So there it is, an 18-tooth rip blade. If you make lots of deep cuts in solid wood, I encourage you to look into one of these for your shop. Time for another pro tip. If you need to make super duper uber accurate adjustments to your saw fence, a mighty mag with a dial indicator is a great help. I find this helpful when sizing kumiko strips, as well as trying to center a cut on a workpiece, such as a tenon or a groove. Here's where I was going to talk about this 1/4 inch groover. It's 10 inches in diameter and has 24 teeth. I've had this blade for years and I love it. The problem is it's about $225. During the videoing of this video, lightning struck my brain and I had what I think was an idea. Maybe I should look into a lower cost option. I found that CMT, which stands for Country Music Television, has a very neat option for a 1/4 inch groover, and that is their box joint set. What's super cool about this set is it's 2 identical 1/4 inch blades, so you get a great 1/4 inch groover times 2, but when you put them together, the result is a 3/8 inch groove. This is different from most other box joint sets in that you can achieve the 1/4 inch groove with only one blade. A small convenience, but a convenience nonetheless. Yes, a 1/4 inch groove can be cut with a dado stack. However, I like that I can get to a perfect 1/4 inch groove with zero setup. I find this convenient for making grooves for drawer box bottoms and when making shaker doors with an MDF panel. I pop the blade in and get to cutting, and I know that my panel will have a nice friction fit. Of course, this blade could be used for box joints or any other joinery where a flat bottom cut is desirable. One more consideration, these blades are 8 inches in diameter. This means they can't take as deep of a cut as the 10-inch blade, but for the most part, I'm making grooves that are 1 inch deep or less. So that larger, much heavier 10-inch blade is just beating up my arbor bearings for no good reason. After a few test cuts, I'm happy enough with the CMT blade to keep using it. Time will tell if it stands up to the rigors of my shop. Oh, and last thing, this set is under $80, so I think it's a pretty good value. Well, look at that. Friction fit, nice cut quality, perfectly flat bottom, plus a cool carrying case. Pro tip time. Time for just a tip. If you have two identical saw blades, it's possible to space them apart and cut tenons. The benefit of this method is that you can set up your tenons to match a specific cutter. So if you mortise with a 1/4 inch router bit, when setting up the blades, take notes about what spacers and shims are used to cut a tenon to match that mortise, and you'll be able to recreate that setup each and every time. Next up is a 7 1/4 inch circ saw blade. These are used in skill saws at every job site across the country, probably across the world. I like these Diablo blades with 60 teeth. They cut smooth and they're cheap. The special thing about these blades is that they make a 1/16 inch-ish kerf, or about half the thickness of a standard 10-inch blade. I use this blade for cutting super thin kumiko parts, but it works well for cutting thinner materials. It also would work well for cutting lots of little parts in a highly valuable material, since about half as much is being turned into sawdust. Totally random side note, due to its small size, it's also very quiet when compared to a 10-inch blade. The downside, of course, is cutting capacity, only about 1 5/8 inch or so on my particular saw. Getting tired of the phrase pro tip, but here's another one, I guess. A power feeder can easily be added to a table saw. Mount the mount to a block of wood, clamp the block of wood to the table saw, and get to work. These things aren't light, so keep the size to 1/4 horsepower or less. The benefits include keeping your nose pickers away from the blade, speeding up work when there's lots of cuts, but most importantly, keeping consistent downward pressure on the cut, which results in really nice bevels, dados, and grooves. This is a Wobble dado. I included this one mostly for fun. These, for the most part, have been relegated to the annals of history. Just as the name implies, it wobbles back and forth to cut a particular sized dado. It has two little bevel thingies, I guess you'd call them, that when spun, it changes the amount of wobble and therefore the size of the dado created. The whole idea just strikes me as odd. I think the only logical explanation for this thing is that a Bond villain-like guy, probably named No Finger, came up with the idea. He was so proud he called a staff meeting. He proposed this idea to his henchmen. One of them raised his hand and said, "Well, why not just use 2 or more saw blades?" And immediately he hit a button and the guy flipped back out of his chair into a fiery pit. Then he asked, "Are there any more questions?" "Good, when can we begin production?" That was a long walk for a short dive. One positive side is since it's just one blade with not many teeth, it doesn't take much power to swing these. I guess the only practical case I could make for one of these in a modern shop would be for cheap money you could have a couple of these set up for specific tasks. All right, time for another tip. I like magnetic dado shims. These are awesome because they're labeled and they're magnetic. The steel shims that come with dado stack tend to fall down into the threading, and then they get caught in there as the arbor nut's tightened up, and that mucks up the inside, and that can throw off the setting of the dado a little bit. So what's awesome about these is they stay in place and they don't fall down into the threading on the arbor. Here's one you've probably never heard of, but could be of great use. If your saw doesn't have a scoring blade like most cabinet saws, but you find yourself in a position where you need to cut melamine or plywood, this could be the blade for you. It's called a hollow grind, and look at that neat tooth pattern. This blade geometry was developed for vertical panel saws when most of them didn't have scoring blades, but they still needed to cut melamine cleanly. So here's the exit wound left from my 40 tooth blade. The other side is the exit wound left from the hollow grind. And of course, the top is absolutely flawless. So at this point, I can hear you yelling at your viewing device, "Yeah, but how does it work on plywood, you bald tire?" Well, pretty much perfectly. This blade is awesome with two caveats. One, it's not cheap. It's normally under $200, so it's not crazy either. And also, it dulls a little quicker than your average table saw blade. And I recommend sending it back to the manufacturer for resharpening just to make sure it's done right. It's a fairly complex sharpening process. Okay, so now you're saying, but I don't want to spend a ton of money on a saw blade that will get used very infrequently. Okay, fair enough. Fear not, I've got you. Back to the basics. Install the highest tooth count blade you have. Hopefully it has a negative hook and a high ATB. Raise the blade so that it just kisses the bottom of the workpiece, making a scoring cut. Once done, raise the blade and come back and finish the job. This works totally awesome. The only downside here is it's slow. This next saw blade is for the lazy fine woodworker. All of the teeth are ground to the same angle, in this case 9.5 degrees. This blade was designed to cut the tail portion of a dovetail on a table saw. So the blade is tilted 9.5 degrees, making the top of each tooth parallel with the saw table. Next, some kind of jig will need to be used to hold the workpiece steady. From there, it's a simple matter of raising the saw blade height and making a test cut. I would call that a little too high, but good enough for a YouTube video, am I right? Lay out the layout and then get to cutting. This really makes cutting the tail portion of a dovetail as easy as pie. I'd like to give credit where credit is due. I picked up this tip from the marvelous, magical, mystical Mr. Mike Pekovich. He's the captain over at Fine Woodworking magazine. He's both a great furniture maker and teacher. After the cuts have been made, there's a little nubbin that I clean up with a chisel. This could be cut with the table saw blade if a wider spacing is used between the tails. This isn't a dovetail video, so we'll plow through some of this stuff, though I do have a dovetail video on my channel, so check that out. I do want to mention a fun tip though. I suggest when purchasing a dovetail blade for your saw, pick an angle that you can also get a magnetic dovetail jig to match. So both the Katz Moses jig, that's 6-to-1, and also the Veritas jig will match the 9.5 degree angle of this saw blade. I like options. This keeps my options open as to how I complete the dovetail joint. So there it is, a saw blade to cut dovetails on the table saw. It's a fun blade with a single purpose, but if you're of the mind to cut dovetails, this is a pretty accurate and efficient way to do so. Quick tip, make an insert with a splitter. This is awesome for saws without splitters or riving knives. Put a fresh zero clearance insert in, raise the blade all the way up, and then glue a little piece of wood in the kerf. This works really well and it's super easy to do. Ooh, this one is very rare. I used one of these in a shop I worked at a long time ago. It's called the Modulus 2000, which is also the name of Harry Potter's broom, I think. These haven't been made for like 8 or 10 years. I always wanted one, but I could never afford it. And then they went out of business. Well, I bumped into this one on eBay and picked it up for just a few bucks. This is a way to add a scoring blade to a traditional cabinet saw. Much like the tip I showed earlier about scoring the bottom of a panel, then making the full cut, well, this does it in one step. Many of today's modern sliding table saws and vertical panel saws have this feature built in from the factory. It's bolted to the arbor as per usual. The pins on the rear are held in by this spring-loaded bracket, which is affixed to the saw. I think this is such a neat idea, and it really solves a problem that many small shops struggle with, cleanly cutting sheet goods. I also think this thing is way overly complex to sell and make money doing so, hence the reason I think they stopped production. Another issue is that setup is critical, yet finicky. But once the rear bracket is aligned and a custom insert has been made, it's not much different than changing out any other saw blade. If you're going to shop for one of these for your saw, they come in right and left tilt versions, and you'll need the bracket for your particular saw. I think eBay's probably the best option at this point. The blades, belts, and bearings are all still available, as are some of the proprietary parts, so that's cool. Well, there it is, the Modulus 2000 scoring saw, a super neat saw blade that has unfortunately gone the way of the dodo.
All right, time for a super easy pro tip. These big openings in a table saw reduce the dust collection efficiency. Use magnetic sheets to cover up those openings. They come off in a jiff if you need to make a bevel cut, and you can put it on the other side.
Time for some never-ending self-promotion. This is the mighty double taper sanding disc. Here's my original prototype. I still use it almost daily in my shop. Here's my latest version. I've added some laser engraving and some chamfers. I'm very proud to say that this disc is machined right here in the USA, and in fact right here in Denver, Colorado. I sell 4 different sandpaper grits, 80, 120, 150, and 180. Sandpaper can be applied to both sides of the disc. And I sell a few different arbor sizes, 5/8 inch, of course, 1 inch, and 30 millimeter with the brake pin holes. The disc installs much like a table saw blade, but due to the taper, the arbor needs to be leaned over 2 degrees. The purpose of the taper is to create a wider opening at the front and back of the disc, with the center portion of the disc doing most of the sanding work. This setup allows the disc to sand a perfect 90-degree edge on a workpiece. It's also very safe and accurate. In particular, this is great for door and drawer parts, face frames, glue-ups. It works well on MDF, plywood, and solid wood. Couple of fun tricks. It's great for back beveling doors. For this, I just leave the saw arbor at 90 degrees, which ends up giving me a nice 2-degree back bevel on all my doors. Also, it can sand other angles. For example, the raised panel door I cut earlier. Now, since I know you'd like one for your shop, I've included a link below, or you can just visit mikefarrington.com for all the pertinent details.
All right, time for another table saw tip. Sometimes it could be advantageous to use 2 miter gauges and connect them with a block of wood. So this is kind of halfway between using a table saw sled or just a miter gauge. Give you a little bit more stability than a miter gauge alone, but not quite as cumbersome as using a table saw sled.
Next on the agenda is a molding head called the Magic Molder. I actually ended up with 2 of these, one that's been bored out for my shaper. Molding heads really open up what a table saw can do, and I just happen to really like this version. It's quick and easy to change the profiles. There's a ton of profiles available, and it's about as safe as can be with a molding head on a table saw. Setup is pretty straightforward. Often a sacrificial fence is needed. Once that's set, from there it's just a matter of setting the height. Now, when cutting, I think it's important to use a fairly slow feed rate to ensure a good finished surface. Keep in mind this thing only has 2 teeth. To me, that surface is good enough to go right to finish with no additional sanding needed. Cutting beads is one of the strengths of the Magic Molder. Making beaded face frames, doors, paneling, molding, it's all easily done. Beaded paneling is always a challenge. This process really can't be done with a router or a shaper, but the table saw makes quick work of this tedious task. The neat thing about using the table saw is that custom spacing can be used to kind of help center or create a more even look to the beads for a particular application. So here's the main reason I ended up buying one of these. Cutting fluted columns. This is something I did a lot for a good long time. I lived in a neighborhood where this detail was used in many homes, from door moldings to fireplaces and so on. Cutting flutes with a router is so-so at best. The bottom of the flute normally needs sanding where the center point of the bit is spinning, and then it's difficult to avoid burning at the start and stop points. With the molding head, the direction of cut is very natural for this process. I've drawn some lines on the molding head to set the fence, and I've drawn some lines on the fence and workpiece as start and stop references. Also glued some handles on. Control during the plunge is critical both for safety and then, of course, for a good quality outcome. Fortunately, I have a 2 horsepower rubber mallet to help remove the handles, and as you can see, the result is really nice. Very little sanding is needed. In fact, if this is just going to be painted, no sanding is needed. I could go on for sure. There are a ton of little tasks that can be done on the table saw with a molding head. Now, the downside to the Magic Mike molder is the cost. The head is like $160+ and the plugs are $150 or so a set, and that adds up quick. Fortunately, a more cost-effective alternative has been made for like the last 70+ years and is still being made. This style head, known as the Delta style, can be bought off eBay for just a few dollars. It can actually still be bought new for well under $100. There's also a Craftsman version, which is basically the same thing. These are high-speed steel knives versus carbide for the Magic Molder, so they won't stay sharp as long. Installation isn't as positive either, but with care it's good enough. To ensure the cutter is centered, I wiggle it back and forth while tightening it. Cutting feels pretty much the same, and if a slow feed rate is used, the results are quite nice. I think the Magic Molder is better overall. It sets up easier, it cuts nicer, and it's safer. The cutter has more support and also a limiter in front of the blade to reduce grabbing. With that said, these are minor differences in the real world. Both can be used safely and both can be used dangerously. Also, it should be noted that the Delta style can be sharpened pretty easily, so that's cool. Custom profiles can be made for both, but obviously more expensive for the Magic Molder. Finally, here's a look at the Craftsman versus the Delta style cutters, just so you know what you're looking at.
All right, thanks for hanging and banging with me on this one. Hopefully this video was interesting, entertaining, and educational, and most importantly, not vomitous. Thanks for watching. Till next time.